Greetings, everybody, and welcome to today's colloquium presentation. We begin with our land acknowledgement. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Goyacono, the Cayuga Nation. The Goyacono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on the land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Goyacono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Goyacono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Today, I've asked Bob Boulder to introduce our speaker, and so I'm going to have the pleasure of introducing Bob. Bob, as many of you know, is the Gensler Family Sesquicentennial Executive Director of AAP NYC and a URS alum. Before coming to Cornell to run our program, his professional career included a stint as the Executive Vice President of the New York City Economic Development Corporation, where today's speaker currently works. And so, Bob, take it away.
Great, thank you. Really a wonderful occasion here to welcome Andrew Genn. As a little bit of the backstory, Andrew and I are classmates, class of '89, and we both have a great gratitude to Professor Richard Booth, who is with us. He is directly responsible for this lineage of our both admission to Cornell and, of course, his years of guidance that he provided to us. So a special shout out to Dick, his profound influence on both of our lives. But Andrew, in addition to being a graduate of Cornell, also went on to do his master's at City University at the Graduate Center, a master's degree in political science. And of course, he needs all those skills given that he works at the New York City Economic Development Corporation and serves as the Senior Vice President for Ports and Transportation, which in New York City is a real challenge, and he uses all those skills. The Ports and Transportation Department advances the strategic development of critical projects impacting both the commercial seaports, the airports, the heliports, as well as the rail freight facilities, which we have in New York City, which have an incredibly complex and colorful history. Andrew has worked at New York City Economic Development since 1997. We were colleagues for almost 8 years. We spent a lot of time together in different divisions, but have always had great respect for each other. Andrew has also been leading the strategic plan for the redevelopment of the Port of New York, as well as the comprehensive port improvement plan a number of years ago. And of course, these projects have served as really the guidance that now is informed through our citywide waterfront plan, as well as the mayor's waterfront vision and enhancement strategy. So Andrew's been intimately involved in both the waterfront, active in negotiations with the Port Authority of New York, and of course with many other stakeholders. The New York City waterfront, of course, is vast, many hundreds of miles. So Andrew, in addition to understanding freight systems and the waterfront, has also had a chance to work on promoting other innovations, including the founding of the Metropolitan Rail Freight Council and the North Atlantic Marine Highway Alliance. So with that, Andrew's got a very dynamic presentation for us, a lot of New York history, and I understand other photos of an earlier era. So just as an additional footnote, Andrew and I, besides studying together and spending lots of time quizzing each other on history, statistics, we were also had the good fortune of studying under Bill Goldsmith and Pierre Clavel, as well as Roger Transick. And of course, we would never forget Barclay Jones and all the days of Barclay's amazing lectures. So with that, Andrew, welcome. It's been 35 years of collaboration, and I'm really glad that you're here today.
Thank you, Bob. It's awesome to be here, and I'm coming to you live from Lower Manhattan in an empty office building. So, but it's perfect conditions, and it's great to be back at Cornell. And this is very meaningful to me. So thank you for asking me. Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, Bob, and hello, Professor Booth. It's wonderful to see you. So. I'm going to try to put up my presentation. I'm going to run through it, and I think this is the right one, but Chris, thank you for all your help. Do you see a presentation or no? Oh, I have to share it. Okay. You see it now? Okay.
Yep, it's up there now.
Okay, great. Okay. Thank you so much. And so most of the photos that I've taken, I either took while I was at Cornell 30 years ago, or and developed in the basement of Sibley. So trying to keep it in the family here today. So I titled this "Trucks, Trains, and Ultra-Large Container Ships: Living a Planner's Dream" because I just had no idea, when Dick Booth recruited me for the first ever 4-year urban regional studies program, where I was going. I was originally, I entered Cornell through the Human Ecology School. And the reason for that was, I'm going to change the slides. Tell me if you see, it's a little bit. Do you see the second slide?
Yeah, we see the judge.
Is that okay? Right. So these are my parents. And in 1974, I was walking my dog Sparky, and I said to my father that I wanted to be a veterinarian. And he said, "Oh, well, then you should probably, look at Cornell when you, when you get older." And that just stuck with me, like, I want to go to Cornell. I want to be a veterinarian. It didn't quite work out, on the veterinarian side, but I did get to go to Cornell. I only applied to 3 colleges. I have 2 kids. I'll talk about them more. I think we applied to like 13 colleges for them. And but back in the 1980s, things were a lot simpler. But I did want to start by just honoring, my parents who paid the tuition and were, inspirational to me along the journey, that I feel very fortunate to be, part of, and especially getting me to and from Cornell in the old Volvo. So you see this, so here is a little bit of what life was like when I started as a sophomore, a little snippet of learning about city and regional planning. And, as Bob said, going into the progressive cities class with Pierre Clavel was eye-opening, because who knew there were so many socialists in the United States, right? And that there was a whole, chapter of Bernie Sanders. Who's Bernie Sanders, right? So, and, but that kind of awakening, at the same time, I remember, our, CRP 101 or CRP 100 with Professor Goldsmith, and, learning at that, again, this is in, the mid 1980s, about how important equity is and how little equity, we have in our society. And I was also fortunate to work on the magazine at the time with the graduate students colloquy, and Professor Booth was the one who encouraged me. He said, "Go out there, go take pictures." So I listened to him. He was worried about me, and he kept beating me in squash, and that's when he really started to worry about me. Because I should have been beating you, Dick, at squash, but I never could beat you. And your class, on environmental planning was so inspiring. And what I tried to do in this presentation is to, kind of connect all of the threads of what I learned at Cornell and how it's helped me. And I have to say that there probably isn't a week that has gone by in 30 years where I haven't thought about or applied my Cornell education. And that's really the heart of this presentation. And I also put the contested city book in there because that was one of our books, I think in CRP 100, although I'm not exactly sure, but I actually got to be a student of Professor Mollenkopf at the CUNY Grad Center, and you know, when I got my graduate degree. So, and then on the left side is our Imaginary Cities, which was a Hartel Gallery presentation of 19th century photographs of European cities from the Art Commission, where I was an intern. And Bob and I worked late into the night hanging that thing up in the Hartel Gallery. I think that was okay. And then we were part of this group called the Cornell Organization of Undergraduate Planners, or COUP. We thought that was very clever, right, Bob? COUP or COUP. And this was an effort at that time to work with the architecture students. And we did a nice little symposium with Christian Otto, who was, and I think he got a kick out of working with the planners back then. So this is a lot of what I learned. All these are photos taken in and around, and and I'm so glad you mentioned Barclay Jones, Bob, because there he is. That's a photo in the Hartel Gallery at a mixer. And, you know, one of the things that Barclay really got me turned on to was this notion that somehow Cayuga Lake and Ithaca was connected to the Erie Canal, which was just kind of at the time like one of those like kind of mind-blowing ideas that the economy of places like Lisle and Danby were all part of this canal system and transportation in the 19th century. And it just didn't seem possible, but as I'll talk about later, it's absolutely true. And one of the living legacies in New York City, and I think you know this, Bob, is the right below this tugboat Cornell, which was a Lehigh Valley Railroad tugboat that used to, Lehigh Valley Railroad was the main railroad that served Ithaca. And we used to hear the railroad horns, as they crossed the old octopus back in the day. And the fact that there's a tugboat Cornell that runs up and down the Hudson River and in and around New York City, that's a vestige of that whole era is, kind of mind-blowing to me. So, but Cornell was an inspiring place. We got to see, we were at our era, we had John Reps in the building. We had Colin Rowe in the building. There's Mr. Bacon in the building, and this in the center here, Norm Krumholtz and a whole bunch of us. What's really distracting to me, Bob, is that it looks like it's 1951 in these pictures, right? And it's really not. But and that sort of brings me down to this photo of Willard Strait. I hope most of us know that's Willard Strait. And one thing that I learned in all of this maritime world that I've been inhabiting is that the India House, which is down by Cornell, New York City, and Bob Boulder was one of those places where the mercantilists of New York would go to cut their trade deals. And Willard Strait was one of the big honchos at the India House. So all of these threads kind of connecting, and really just, appreciation for people like Susan Christopherson, who taught us how to read landscapes, Pierre on progressive cities, Dick Booth on environmentalism, and, just raising our awareness. Barclay and Mike Tomlin, historic preservation, and giving us the appreciation for, how planning can preserve these things, and, and just the overall connection to the world of New York City. And here's the first embarrassing photograph. So this is graduation day, May 28th, 1989. And don't we look fabulous, right?
Right there.
Yeah, right there, exactly. So right outside of Sibley. So, it was a great day. It was a great day. But one of the things we learned was, you know, and let me just, this was the graduation speech. Frank Rhodes, you know, his main takeaway was, you know, it's great you all graduated, but, you know, in a couple of days, you're going to ask this question, is that all there is? You know, well, I went through 4 years of Cornell, is that it? You know, and it's like, well, no, now is the start of your life. So let me start with my life. And the part one was, you know, I didn't graduate into a job. I graduated into an internship. I eventually got my first job, and then I got my first layoff. Bob, you probably, I don't know if you remember any of this, but I started at the Regional Plan Association, mostly because I saw, you know, in the library at Sibley, lots of old documents from the Regional Plan Association. So that seemed good enough to me, you know, go work there. They must know something about planning in New York. So I was hired as an intern at $15 an hour, which I guess is, we still don't have that as the federal minimum wage. So maybe I shouldn't. And I was working on a project called New Directions for the Bronx, which in many ways, and I really want to point this out, I was directly reporting to a man named William B. Shore, who was one of the main, he was the communications person for New York City's or RPA's second regional plan. And, you know, Bill passed away now about 10 years ago, but he was one of those kind of, you know, titans in my life who explained to me how to run effective public engagement that wasn't BS, basically, like how, you know, and sort of, you know, and I think in many ways, you know, the work of John Forrester, you know, would align very well with the notion of, you know, how do you get people into a room to talk about not technical details that they don't know about and shouldn't have to know about, but how do you talk to them about values? What do they want to see about, if through planning, that they want, that can improve their lives? And Bill was really ahead of his time in doing that. He also didn't like the way I took notes. He said I write like a Frenchman, so he helped me with my writing ability. And as he said, you know, just use, you know, declaratory sentences, short, to the point, and that's it. You know, no more of these prepositional phrases. So, and Bill was also an inspiration in terms of like, what are big ideas? Because if you have big ideas, they will continue a conversation. Even if your project doesn't work the first time, the second time, the third time, if you have a big idea and you stick with it, you'll get to where you're going. And that stuck with me. And then I have these little planting seeds icons to say, you know, at RPAs where I learned a little bit more about railroads, because they were asked me to work on the Harlem River Yards, which was this disused railroad yard that had belonged to the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad that the state of New York was trying to reactivate in the Bronx. And I got to write like the memo that said, hey, you know, in our plan, we need to support more rail freight in New York City. So that was a seed. And I also attended a crazy meeting with the Longshoremen's Association where we were talking about building a giant container port on the west side of Manhattan. Thank God that didn't happen. So anyway, I with the help of Dick Anderson, I landed a job at a consultant firm called Alley King, Rosen Fleming, which is now called AKRF. And I was writing I learned about environmental review. Thanks to Professor Booth, like no longer could you just you know, do whatever you want with the environment, but every project that has a discretionary action requires an environmental impact statement. And I was writing sections of environmental EISs for land use, community resources, open space, and historic resources. So, and with that, I came up to the problem of working in a private firm. You need to have billable hours. You have to keep records on these things. And the expectation was like, nobody leaves at 6 o'clock. Nobody leaves at 7 o'clock. Nobody leaves at 8 o'clock. you just keep working. And you know, maybe I'll admit, for my first planning job, that was an eye-opening experience and a lesson learned that I better go work at a public agency. So, and then the economy went soft, and I lost that job. I also lost my father. So that was just, again, a lot of life going on after my graduation from Cornell. But you know, a lot of seeds being planted. I learned about the redevelopment of the west side of Manhattan. I learned about the seeds of development for the Long Island City area, which at that time had like one office building, and now is completely rebuilt. The Hunters Point area. I learned more about writing, and I learned about environmental review. And my next job was I put together my historic preservation skills and went to work at the Queens Historical Society, where I put on a show called The Landmarks of Queens. And I got to go around all of Queens and collect artifacts from each of the landmarks, which was a lot of fun. But I will tell you, I was not much of an archivist. I got my job because I volunteered, and they found out I was a Cornell grad, and they said, "Oh, you must be smart. You know, why don't you be our archivist?" And I learned pretty quickly that I wasn't a trained archivist. So lesson learned there. But part two. So I got what I call my second job at the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. And there I was also working on environmental reviews. I worked there for 5 years. I was overseeing the production of environmental reviews that connected to a lot of important projects, like the construction of the third water tunnel, which began in 1969 and is still not done. But you know, I think hopefully within our lifetime, Bob, it will be done, because New York has 2 water tunnels that cannot be turned off because they never designed a valve 100 years ago to turn them off. So they've never been inspected. So hopefully when the third water tunnel comes online, we'll be able to see what's actually been growing inside the water tunnels. Another great project which connected to upstate, which was inspiring, was the water filtration avoidance EIS, which was, you know, New York has some of the best drinking water in the United States, if not the world, and it's unfiltered, which is pretty extraordinary. But the federal government, the EPA, was kind of saying there's a lot of development, particularly up in Westchester County, and you know, the Croton watershed area, and New York said, well, let's start working with upstate towns. And we had a series of meetings upstate to try to bring together upstate and downstate to create the conditions under which, applying planning principles, you could protect the watershed through best management practices. And for the most part, that has held up. Also learned about a guy named Trump and the Riverside South Project, which is that west side of Manhattan above 59th Street, where Trump had gone in to develop. Then he went bankrupt. Then he got a bunch of investors together and actually worked with the Manhattan Borough President to do a large-scale development, residential development. But what we found was that there wasn't enough capacity in the sewer system, or the sewage treatment system, to be able to handle the wastewater flows. So I got involved in, how do you calculate? No one had been calculating those things. So I helped to create a method for doing that, calculating and estimating wastewater flows from new development. Then DP found out that there was a lot of waste water going into the system that shouldn't have been. They clamped it down, and lo and behold, we found plenty of capacity for the Riverside South development. So a lot of seeds being planted too, because I got involved in, I guess, Bob, this is where I first learned about the Cross Harbor Rail Freight Tunnel, which is the dream of Jerry Nadler, the congressman from the west side of Manhattan, which is where I also live. Talked about New York City's chronic dependency on trucking to move its goods in and out, mostly in. And that's where I met Chris Ward and doing that work for Al Appleton at the time was the commissioner. I also learned about that New York could no longer just dredge its waterways and dump the waste products into the Atlantic Ocean, and that was causing a huge problem for the Port Authority and the Port of New York. I guess the funny story there is I was a Queens kid. I grew up in Queens, landlocked. I barely knew there was a port in New York at this period. So, but when I heard about the dredging crisis, it kind of opened my eyes up, and I knew I liked it very much. So, again, during this time, I also married my wife. I started my MA at the Grad Center. I got to meet John Mollenkoff, and I reconnected with Bob Balder. He showed up to DEP one day.
Exactly.
And then we went to a Yankee game.
That's right. That's right.
I think they won.
Yeah.
So, and more importantly, Bob also, kept me in mind. We, worked a little of that Cornell networking. So Bob landed his job at the newly formed EDC, Economic Development Corporation, which was formed in the ashes of the Public Development Corporation. And then I saw an ad in the New York Times. They used to have these classified ads, really small print that said, we're public agency basically looking for port and rail planners. And at that point, I was more, I thought, interested in railroads because I had done that work on the Harlem River yards. But I applied, and I got the job with some help from my friends who put in a good word. I got this job in 1997, and I haven't left. So now the story gets kind of dull. But in all honesty, it was very interesting because my job was I showed up a few weeks late to the job, and there was a woman who joined EDC ahead of me, and she got the job to work on a major investment plan for the Cross Harbor Rail Freight Tunnel project, which again was Jerry Nadler's vision of building a rail connection between New York City and the rest of the national rail freight network, which, believe it or not, we don't have and still don't have to this day. And I got the job as a port planner, and I put that in exclamation because I had no idea what I was in for, to be honest. I wasn't really trained, but they said, we just want a generalist, get a consultant and start planning the port. So here some seeds are growing into plants. Like I'm actually a planner. I'm not just doing environmental impact statements. I'm also, and I'm very conscious at this time about things I learned, like progressive cities, because a lot of the neighborhoods where New York City's ports exist are working class neighborhoods, areas where inequality has blossomed, inequity. And, one of the things that we tried to do here was address those things, not just plan a port, but plan, correctly, and also to look at the environmental impacts of these things, and both cleaning up the land, putting it to good use, and also cleaning up the air. So, lo and behold, we got the plan done. You see, I put this. This is an old newsletter that we did. And the emphasis here was public outreach and participatory planning. We brought together it was a coalition of industry people, and I'm talking like hard-bitten, like tugboat operators, longshore, unions, and environmental justice groups in places like Sunset Park in Brooklyn and Mariners Harbor in Staten Island. And we really tried to create a dialogue, and the whole time I'm thinking about Cornell. I'm thinking about what I learned, and this is the best management practice that I want to apply. And so I wanted to say that through that effort, I think what we got was a much more balanced plan that resulted in, you know, a balance of port investment and reactivations, as well as something really neat like, actually, let me just jump to this slide, a neighborhood park in Sunset Park, which, you know, came about because we had been talking to the community about what did they really want on their waterfront. And the things that they said were jobs and open space. And that was one of the hallmarks of the plan, was coming up with a place where we could balance port development on one side and open space in between, basically, in this like historic section of the old Brooklyn waterfront. And I think one of the things that I always get a kick out of is this Google Maps image of the actual park juxtaposed against the plan that we had back in you know, 1999, and then you know, a few years later. Of course, I'm a baseball fan, so I was dreaming of 3 baseball diamonds, and we got something that was a little more you know, user friendly. But that was nice. The other thing, I also wanted to point out that this whole idea of greenways on the waterfront came from my model cities class that Bob and I attended. I think that was in the that was in arts and sciences, Bob, right? We were in, yeah, and you took on a role. You did the role playing. Remember that class?
Right.
And
Exactly.
yeah, I had to go and find funding for a waterfront greenway, and I was like, this can't be. No way, this is how the real world works. And it turns out, yeah, that's how the real world works. So the other thing that was going on at this time was, as I mentioned earlier, when I was at DEP, I learned about dredging. And the thing that I learned was, nothing is going to happen in New York Harbor unless we get a handle on dredging. And the reason for that is because most of dredging is generated by runoff from the Hudson Valley that all lands, you know, like kind of Louisiana style at the bottom of the Hudson River. And in the 1990s, Al Gore kind of cut the deal that said no more unrestricted ocean dumping of dredged materials. And the problem with that was there was a need to address the ever-growing size of container ships. Which, you know, famously, we've all seen the saga of the Ever Given in the Suez Canal. Well, at this time, they still were not that big, but there was a lot of controversy between environmental groups and the longshoremen and the port industry. And what we had to do, and this is, again, one of those threads, you know, connecting the job that I had at DP with a friend of mine named John McLaughlin, who was the man at DEP in charge of closing landfills and building natural areas on top of them, building and creating wetlands. And so I called up my friends at DEP and we said, hey, can we use this dredged sediment on these landfills to close them? And so we used a state grant to identify beneficial uses for these dredged materials. So even with levels of contamination, you can turn them into a construction product and use them to put them on top of landfills, which at that time there were 2 landfills in Brooklyn, Penn and Fountain landfill. And but the big hope was that we could apply it at the giant landfill at Fresh Kills. And so we undertook the study. We found that it could be done. And we got the landfills closed. And most importantly, we were able to demonstrate that New Jersey had been doing this work ahead of us because most of the port is in New Jersey, but we demonstrated we could do it in New York City. So that brings me to a little eine kleine maritime history, a little maritime history. And just do a time check. Make sure. I think we're doing okay, right, Bob?
Yep.
Okay. And so I wanted to just use my bully pulpit here to talk a little bit about New York and its harbor, and then that'll lead into the discussion of kind of what we're doing now and what how things have evolved. So the important thing about this is, really begins with the story of, location, location, location. And, after the United States was founded, it was really the issue of how do we develop the hinterlands? And believe it or not, George Washington was a surveyor, and he had a canal company called the Potomac Company. But he had predicted that the way to the interior of the continent would be through New York. And he called New York the seat of empire, because you have these, the mountains in between, the Appalachian mountains that really cut off the coastal cities of the early United States. What George Washington realized was that through the Hudson and Mohawk system, you could get to the Great Lakes, and that his Potomac Company probably wouldn't get there, or in such a big way. So, the rest is kind of, oh, I've got a little glitch here, but just to say, like, New York Harbor was the key, to be able to engage in world trade. And New York Harbor had these great advantages from its competitor ports, particularly Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, because it has a natural sheltered harbor, actually less ice and fog than those other harbors, and a shorter sailing time to the ocean. So New York had a lot of these advantages. Oh, there it is. So you can sort of see the, and it really jumps out, just the fact that New York Harbor is a series of bays: Jamaica Bay, New York Harbor, and Raritan Bay. I'm sorry, Newark Bay. And so the first step in world trade, right after the British departed, was the sailing of the Empress of China to go to China, actually carrying ginseng root and furs in exchange for teas, chinaware, silk, and satin. And New York kind of led that first foray into world trade for the United States. But what really established us as a port of entry was the creation of the Erie Canal in 1831. And then that gave New York the advantage of really controlling its hinterlands in a way that Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia were unable to do. And we know 513 miles, and the third bullet here really makes the point of, the freight rates went from the overland $100 a ton to $6 a ton, which is, really, the story here. And just the, the engineering feats in places like Lockport, creating bridges over which, canal boats could travel. And again, for me, in the back of my mind is, and giving a place in the economic spectrum for places like Ithaca, Lisle, and Danby, which, and this is a photo of the marriage, or the image of the marriage of the waters, where, they set off cannons beginning in Buffalo, in the Erie Basin in Buffalo, for the whole length of the canal when it opened. And each time they heard a cannon fire, then the next cannon fired until it reached New York Harbor, which is just incredible, spectacle. And then they had a ceremony in New York Harbor where they mixed water from the Amazon, the Ganges, and Lake Erie, right? And really created sort of the conditions where New York became the dominant part of global trade for the United States. And at the same time, I have another glitch here, I apologize for that. But New York was dominating in terms of creating things like the clipper ships, the steam engines, Robert Fulton, the creation of like scheduled services. And, you know, the practice had been that a ship would sit at the end of South Street, and then the merchants would deliver their goods. And when the ship was full, then it would sail. Well, the New York merchants changed that. The Black Ball Line in 1811 said, you know what, we're sailing at this time, you know, certain time, you bring your goods to the pier, and then we're going no matter what. And that kind of revolutionized shipping between New York and Europe. You know, also was, you know, influential in the cotton trade and connecting the South to the markets in Europe with cotton, that actually allowed Great Britain to shift a lot of its land towards industrial development, because they were getting cotton out of the United States. Also led to the creation of the finance and insurance industries right down by Cornell offices. So, you know, a lot of legacy, and the legacy that Willard Straight carried on into the early 20th century. So just here, you know, by 1860, New York was far and away the biggest port. And then it just came to a crashing halt for New York in the mid 20th century with the invention of containerization, which I might add was invented right under the shadow of New York. You know, if we didn't have these political divisions, you know, let's give it up for Port Newark and Port Elizabeth, because that's where containerization began, when a trucker named Malcolm McLean got tired of waiting for his ship to be loaded up in Hoboken, which is where On the Waterfront was filmed, by the way, and said, why don't we devise a system where we just take the whole bloody trailer off of the truck and put it onto a ship. And in 1962, the first purpose-built container port was built. And wanted to also point out too that this tradition of the ports being like environmental wastelands, and you know, the use of our waterfront. A lot of the work that I know Bob does through the APA, the Metro Division, is how do we clean up? We're still cleaning it up, right, Bob? Like how the waterfront has been treated. So, but the decline of New York Harbor happened very quickly, and it was dramatic, and it was very dislocating. So in 1960, 75% of the cargo was going into Brooklyn and Manhattan. By 1970, almost all of it, or the majority, had shifted to the New Jersey container ports. And while we were still building obsolete facilities like Pier 40, right, Bob? That we, yeah. So, you know, and that left a lot of vacant land, a lot of underutilized land, which, you know, remind me very much of what we learned in Roger Transik's class about all of the cities that were dealing with similar issues, but were redeveloping their waterfront. Well, I think New York was kind of lagging behind in terms of redeveloping the Manhattan and Brooklyn waterfronts. And Queens, So, but there's another story, you know, and that is that movement of cargo by water is still happening in New York. We're still a city of islands. We still have millions of tons of fuel, solid waste, all types of liquid bulk, and and even railroad cars. So this is the image on the top right is we still float full trains across New York Harbor, which is kind of mind-blowing, but also thanks to Chris Ward, it still exists, and my predecessor at EDC. And that's a good thing because, you know, especially in this time where we are so concerned about climate change, you know, for the right reasons, and the use of energy. Water, because of, is really the best way to move. It's better than railroads and better than trucking by a factor of 10. And one of the things that we learn, and the image here is actually the Erie Canal today, you know, where they still are moving freight from time to time. So, so what we what we try what we're trying, I think, what I've been trying is to kind of, relearn the lessons of the past and in that sense, revitalize, this old system. So what I've wanted to point out here is that, trade has it, even though the harbor may have been concentrated in one area, which is mostly in New Jersey, the demand for goods has increased dramatically over this period. And the ships have gotten larger. The port is more intensely used than ever before. And a number of municipal functions, including almost all of the city's solid waste, is now moved by water, and not just dumped, but managed carefully. And so, again, as planners, I think it's important for us to realize that a lot of these old systems have value. And so, just some examples here of how vibrant New York still is. We still are the largest or sort of home for tugboats and barges on the North Atlantic coast. And that's been increasing. We still have about 12,000 people working in the trades and $1 billion in income. And just today, in an average year, 3 million trucks are taken off the road by maritime commerce. So something to build on. And that leads to part 4 of my story, which is Freight NYC, which is the distillation of these ideas. And, in more recent times, what we've tried to focus on has been, how do we get New Yorkers good jobs in these industries? And that's, and I think when I started this job, the physical planning was probably the way I got into it. And definitely the coolness factor for me, anyway, of the big ships and the trains. But the thing that I did learn at Cornell was, through really in most all of the classes, is that none of this is worth much if people aren't benefiting from the economic development and how you connect. So I'm very happy that, the way that we were able to sort of put a freight plan together for New York City was through a jobs plan. And so in the 2018 jobs plan, we were able to really fit a freight, blueprint for how to modernize the city's freight systems. And just again, to put a little bit more of a marker on kind of what our planning principles were. This up arrow on the right side is really the cautionary tale of freight volumes have grown along with the population and the buying power of New Yorkers. So, but that's juxtaposed to increasing congestion, which costs us about over 800 million a year in just lost benefit. And that's slated to increase by 68% on the volume side and up to $1 billion a year just lost in economic activity. And also recognizing that we're a big, there are still many jobs in distribution and for freight. So, and the essential conundrum comes down to this. We have one major gateway for freight into New York City. It's the George Washington Bridge. Almost 90% of our freight arrives by truck, which is, as I said, the worst way to move freight on an environmental basis per ton of greenhouse gas emissions. And at the same time, we have the ability, or we have these systems that we haven't really employed because we're just used to using the highways. So Freight NYC in a nutshell is about promoting the use of maritime, reactivating rail lines, creating modern distribution systems, and really, I guess the cherry on top is adopting clean vehicles to do the last mile delivery. And also, in recognition that you have environmental justice communities around most of the city's distribution areas, and we don't want pollution from trucks in those communities. So So one major concept we've been working on, and Bob talked about it, is creating a regional partnership called the North Atlantic Marine Highway Alliance, which brings together the Northeast ports from Maine to Virginia to look at how we can shift a lot of freight to waterways, including just entire trucks onto barges, as well as within the port, just making local moves between the New Jersey ports and the distribution centers in New York City. The other major plan here is increasing rail moves, and in that we created the Metropolitan Rail Freight Council, which involves all of the railroads in New York, which there are actually, surprisingly, there are now 8 railroads, both large ones and small ones, and creating more transload areas within the city to make it easier for freight to move by rail. And at the same time, looking deeply at the major freight hubs in New York. And I would just say that with the advent of e-commerce, particularly during the COVID crisis, this is all happening really on its own. Like these circles here are all booming with distribution, mostly Amazon, by the way. So we are talking to Amazon, we're talking to UPS about applying these tenets and updating the way freight moves. And hopefully in this next infrastructure bill that President Biden has been advocating for, and we have some friends who formerly of New York City Department of Transportation involved in making the reality of electric trucks more widespread for the delivery of goods. So for New York City, that means increased resiliency because there are more ways of getting freight into the city, redundancy, and actually using maritime is more resilient because what we've seen with sea level rise, nothing does better in the water than a boat to protect, to float and to keep going. Redundancy is we need solutions that go beyond just the trucking over the bridges, and an increase in sustainability by moving to vessels and trains. And it's kind of the summary of this is create a lot of jobs in the supply chain industry, reduce truck miles traveled, eliminate truck trips where you can, reduce greenhouse gases by a significant amount, and also reduce the diesel particulate emissions as well. And then the last piece of this is also looking at workforce development, and in that we've been partnering with a New York City public school, several schools actually, including one in Harlem called the Urban Assembly School for Global Commerce. I know, Bob, you work closely with the Harbor School. Global Commerce is a supply chain high school, which teaches kids about all these trends. I actually got to teach a class a year ago with the students, and we have great partners there as well, because a lot of companies are looking for, there's a gap because most people don't know about supply chain and the good paying jobs in it. So companies like Cisco, UPS, FedEx recently joined the partnership board, New York City DOT, because it's really helpful to start at the high school level to get kids interested, just like with the Harbor School, where we teach kids maritime trade and about ecology of the harbor. This is a way for them to get up to date and actually go out and see port facilities themselves. So, this is, some images of the students, partners from Cisco, and the principal out at the Red Hook Container Terminal. So.
That's fabulous.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, Andrew, that was really tremendous. What an overview, and we really deeply appreciate all of the kind of career insights. That's always, I think, a critical aspect of these conversations is how it all happened and what kind of steps you took to build your career. So that's a real bonus for all of us today. So I'm going to open it up for questions. I want to, and Chris, you might have to help me. I'm actually trying to access the I have the chat, but I'm not seeing.
Oh, I should go in the chat.
Yeah, the chat's pretty quiet in there, but Chris, just guide me. Is there a list of questions that are already emerging? I'm looking for that site now.
It looks like Alvino has his hand raised.
Okay.
Did you have a question?
Yeah,
I do have a question. Can I go ahead and ask?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Please,
Okay.
please.
Andrew, thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. It was awesome hearing your story after Cornell, and just sort of seeing the journey that your life has taken. And also learning a little bit more about New York's maritime history. That was really nice. I have a question about this sort of labor relations aspect of increasing the use of port and rail. Because I know that truckers are already sort of, getting lower and lower pay for the work that they do across the country. So how do you sort of balance that out? Yes, there's 5,000 new jobs in the port and rails, but then all these truckers that were using that additional money coming from the long miles that they drive will no longer be receiving that because their trucks are just going to get on boats.
Yeah, no, and that's something that's a great question because it is a concern with the trucking industry. And I guess when we have those conversations, we emphasize to them, like, do you really want to be stuck in traffic, waiting to get over the George Washington Bridge? I can tell you too that, a company like UPS, they came to us because they couldn't get their cargo from Newark Airport into Manhattan because the Lincoln Tunnel is just so chronically backed up during their critical periods of the day. And then with the advent of e-commerce, like the velocity of the freight coming into New York City is just so high that that unreliability is forcing them to look at things like moving by water because they're fearful of that productivity of their truckers being so low. So there's that piece to it. The other thing I also wanted to say, and I'll be quick here, Bob, is just that there is a nationwide deficit in the number of truck drivers, about 200,000, I think of the latest count. It's hard to get people to do those long haul trucking jobs because it's not great. It's just not great lifestyle. So the idea of taking, a lot of the trucks and moving them by water or moving by rail, but doing last mile deliveries, by truck should open up more jobs for people and better quality of life. And at least that is our story. And I do believe that's where we're going. So.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to hand it over. Nima, I know you have a question.
Thank you, Bob. Great. Andrew, thank you so much for coming. As Alviano said, I love to hear the stories of like life trajectories. It's really quite wonderful. So that's, so thank you for that. Really appreciate it. But I'm very curious about how, you're working in the city, the kinds of conversations that are happening based on what's going to happen, be the post-pandemic sort of period. We're already reading in the Times about how Manhattan's going to be emptying out and people are not going to be moving in. I mean, people aren't going to be coming in. So there's like huge changes in the offing, or maybe not. I'm very curious, and I'm sure everybody else on the call is, about what are the conversations happening within city government?
Well, it's there's a lot of concern. We meet every month with our fellow agencies to talk about trends. The greatest sense is that, people know that it's not going to be the same city, particularly with office workers, that, the trend towards people working from home will likely continue. And that's going to then pose a lot of questions to owners of real estate, like what do you do with all of the, office space that is being sub-optimized, consolidated. But I would also say, that there remains a lot of optimism that, New York's been counted out before, and that we may be on the cusp of kind of like a roaring 20s scenario where we come out of our shells and go, once more people are vaccinated. And the idea of New York, remains as strong as ever. And that the growth that we've seen over the past 20 years may be different, but it's not all going to go away. So there's it's a mix, I would say. And from our point of view, we are still planning for growth within the city.
Right. Good. Thank you. Let's over to Cheng. You have a question?
Yes. So that kind of question, follow up on the question before that, was relating to the truck and the industry, which is what do you see in the next 5-10 years? Self-driving has been kind of a big hype almost. Where do you see that change the sailing of the boats, the autonomous trucks coming in and now? Does that solve the traffic jam, or does that give less employment? Can you talk a little bit about those and your conversations with them?
Yeah, no, a few years ago, everything was autonomous trucks, autonomous cars. And then we learned that the technology is not quite there yet. And I think particularly for New York City, trucks are not going to be autonomous. I think where they'll be adopted first will be on, cross-country trips for sure. But you still have to have somebody in charge when the trucks get to the other side, get to the loading dock. And so managing the end, it's like flying an airplane. The tough part is not just flying, the tough part is taking off and landing. So I think I haven't seen those details worked, really work to a place where I have a lot of confidence that we're going to see any of that, certainly in New York City. Now, having said that, there are certain areas where we're looking at where there are closed loops within the city, even some of the old rail lines, that I think you might be able to, in addition to, as we say, steel wheels, you could have rubber tires in autonomous operation. And Bob, I'm thinking of the Bay Ridge line, but I do think these technologies are evolving, and inevitably they're going to get better. The one I'm really looking at is the clean trucks and EVs, and really hoping that Biden, the president's plan, puts us in the right direction. Because what you need is charging stations. You need to have a grid so that you can always plug in. You don't lose a charge while you're dropping off freight.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. We have a question from Quinn Kelly. Quinn, do you want to turn on your screen and we can hear from you?
Sure. Yeah. So thank you so much for speaking, Andrew. I was also a URS student and spent several years working in New York City after graduation, and really enjoyed just having that network of folks like in all different, agencies and consultants throughout the city. I wanted to ask you if you had thoughts about congestion pricing and how that's going to impact freight operations through New York City?
Yeah, the answer is yes. Cannot wait. And that actually, to Nima's point, that is one of the things I should have mentioned that could be a change agent, like making it more expensive, particularly for commercial vehicles to enter into the CBD, both Midtown and Lower Manhattan. And it may be the thing, it's that pricing that really is the key. Every time the Port Authority raises tolls on the George Washington Bridge, we're so happy. We probably shouldn't be, but we are. And because it's getting, we really should be doing carbon pricing. We're not. So this is the next best thing. And I think, as it will make a lot of these maritime is expensive. That's our biggest challenge, and the more you touch a truck or a piece of freight, the more it costs. So, and the problem with trucking, especially in the Northeast, is that it's just so heavily subsidized by the highway system and all that investment that we've got to even the playing field. So if we're not going to do carbon pricing, Mitt Romney notwithstanding, we got to do something like congestion pricing.
Great, great. We have a little bit more time. We'd love to see if there are other questions that people have. Oh yes, there it is, Professor Booth. I knew he was coming in soon. There he is.
Hi,
Andrew. It's wonderful to see you. You don't look
Wonderful
much
to see you.
older, which is remarkable.
More hair.
With your historical perspective, you remind us that whatever we're seeing today is a result of lots of decisions over time. Many decisions accurately predicted the future, and many inaccurately predicted what eventually happened. As you look back, two questions as you look back.
Yeah.
One, looking back, what is something that has changed for the better that you would not have anticipated when you started working 25 years ago? And secondly, the other side of that, what is something when you were looking forward 25 years ago, you said, we really ought to try to accomplish that, and we haven't accomplished it. So, you've now worked a long time for a big city, and someone with your experience can look back. So as you look back, what's something that has surprised you that we've done well? And what is something that you thought years ago we should make progress on and we haven't made as much progress?
It's interesting, Professor Booth, because the first thing that jumps out is like New York. We were worried about New York. Even when I started the job in '97, when Bob was here, we were still concerned that New York wasn't going to survive. And I think the thing that I marvel at is that the center really held the idea of New York as a place that was desirable, that was where there was innovation, just to think about, like, we were looking at Brooklyn. I remember my first meeting with the borough president of Brooklyn, and we wanted to talk to him about our port plan, and he didn't care. He just wanted the nets to move to Brooklyn from New Jersey. And lo and behold, that happened. And it happened because there was, a great appreciation of urban life as a thing that was desirable again, and raising families and having lots of children. I mean, it's almost hysterical how many strollers you see on the Upper West Side or in Park Slope, or in Prospect Heights where Bob is, or, and that was something where I think we got right, like that holding the line and saying, like, it's okay to live in cities. I think the thing that's most disappointing, and I gotta say this, is just that I feel like we took such a step backward in terms of equity, and that was the other side of it. Like, we always were envisioning, what's New York look like if people want to live here and wealth comes back? And I don't think we managed wealth coming back very well. And so, and Bob, you can chime in here. I felt like when we started EDC, the whole idea was, how do we get really smart people from Ohio to move to New York after they go to grad school at Harvard and Princeton, and Cornell, I guess.
Yep.
And we won. We got all those people, but economic development wasn't always done at the local level for people who live in New York City. And New York still has a poverty rate of close to 20%, which is just astoundingly embarrassing. And so, on that vital issue of how do you take wealth and distribute it more evenly and give people opportunities who are already here, I think that's what we have to work on, and that's why we've tried to build that in what we do at EDC. But I think it's only recent that we've really thought hard about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree that the amount of displacement, I think, has really surprised a lot of people. The market has not worked evenly for a lot of people. I do have a question from a local Queens native. I'm going to hand it over to Ari Billy. Ari was in our colloquium in the fall, and she's coming to study with us this fall, Andrew. So you'll get to meet her soon enough, but here she is.
Oh, great.
Hi, Andrew. Nice to meet you. Thanks for
Hi.
coming in. I just wanted to ask what, in like the waterfront development projects, how public outreach takes place and how you gauge what the community actually wants to see in the projects and stuff like that.
Oh. So what's so interesting with public outreach with the waterfront is that everyone's into it, you know, and people, particularly in the neighborhoods where we work in, are very sophisticated and smart about what they want. And so when we were doing our participatory planning, you know, one thing I learned was there really is nothing you can't share with the local community that they won't understand. And if you, you know, if you disagree on something, you know, you could probably find a compromise, because what the community wants is the jobs, the open space, and better environmental outcomes. And what's interesting is we found that the communities are more allies with us, because the one thing they don't want is gentrification in many cases. So when we, for instance, cited the municipal recycling facility in that Sunset Park community, they were all for it, because they were like, this is great. It's blue collar jobs, you know, and it's a little bit dirty, but it's going to be managed well. So that'll keep like the gentrifiers away. And they were kind of right. Now, one thing I didn't mention that they also are very supportive of is offshore wind. And that area of South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, that we call it, is going to be where Equinor, the Norwegian company, is going to be doing the staging for the wind farms off the Atlantic coast that are going to help, you know, to transform, you know, this city's electric grid. And the community has been strongly for it, as have been the port interests. And one thing I also wanted to say on that was that waterfront park that I showed you came out of that process where the community said, hey, Brooklyn Bridge Park is happening, you know, why does Brooklyn Heights need a park? Like, they go to the Hamptons, you know, what about us? And we said, well, let's work on doing some open space. And, you know, lo and behold, there was a coalition. We went to the Department of State, got a grant, a planning grant, got the design, and it resulted in this in federal money, state money, city money coming together. And once you do that and you build trust with the community, you show you can deliver those things, which and I can tell Bob in his career has done this 10 times more than I have. But it's right, Bob, you find that then you kind of you break the ice, and then everything's possible.
Yep, absolutely. Jeff, you're next.
Hi. Thank you, Andrew. It's been interesting listening to you talk about the mix of concerns, jobs, gentrification, freight, environmental issues, et cetera, and how these all come together in the things that you do. But how does your agency, how does the city coordinate around these issues? How does what you want to do, say, with the George Washington Bridge, get coordinated with everybody else in the city who has an agenda or responsibility for the George Washington Bridge?
We have a good relationship, believe it or not, with the Port Authority and with New York City Department of Transportation. And we actually talk more often than we don't talk. We have very open lines of communication. And so even on these plans, all of these plans that we've been working on, we're doing in coordination with really what is kind of a very small subset of planners in New York. And what we try to do is balance those things. The other thing that works too is that, we're the Metropolitan Planning Organization that programs the federal money. Kind of the system works in a way in that it demands that you get your projects onto the Transportation Improvement Plan. So that's a forum where the planners at the Department of City Planning, DOT, Port Authority, EDC, we're kind of forced to, kind of show what we want to do, and also conform those projects on an air quality basis as well. So, in some ways that environmental review, those things do work to kind of bring us together. But on the freight side, I'll tell you, it's a bit of a club. We all know each other pretty well. And then the challenge is, how do you get the decision maker's ear? And that's, so in our case, like, the jobs plan was the vehicle in. So you have to be clever and find what's the flavor of the month, to get your ideas out.
Great. Natani, let's turn it over to you.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for coming and speaking to us today. I've really enjoyed it so far. I have a question kind of more so on how do you personally try to weigh, like, I guess the cost of having, like, adding jobs to the labor market versus, potential health concerns from pollutants coming from, the industrial side of things. So I just wondered, to you, where do you draw that line and how do you kind of make those decisions?
Yeah, no, that's such an important thing is I think part of it is always trying to do betterments. So, the whole idea of shifting away from trucks towards waterborne and rail is a betterment in and of itself. But and you found me, the problem is that ship emissions are not great. Ships burn something called bunker fuel, and just the name alone, it's just like, don't burn bunker fuel. It's basically asphalt. It's liquid asphalt. And so, one way we've addressed that, Natani, is the shore power systems that we built at the Brooklyn Cruise Terminal, which is a way that we call it cold ironing, where you turn off the vessel engine when it's docked and then plug into the power grid. The problem is our power grid's not so great. So that's why projects like the offshore wind are important to supplement the power grid. And, and I guess that's one of the lessons learned that I found, is that it's always a long game, particularly with transportation planning. You have to set the goals, that leadership of the idea, the good ideas, and then just keep going, don't stop. And so we have to decarbonize freight transportation. That's the big goal. And that's why we're, honestly very excited about the new leadership in Washington, because it feels like it's going in that direction.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sure.
Andrew, we just lightly touched on the offshore wind piece, and I know that's gotten a lot of attention at the state side with Governor Cuomo. For this audience, maybe we could kind of plant a few seeds as maybe a future conversation as things continue to progress. But could you give us a little bit of an overview of kind of where we are on that, and maybe a little bit more about your role in it? Because I've heard a little bit of detail through the Waterfront Alliance, but would love to get your perspective on this.
Sure, Bob. Let's see. Well, there's a good Cornell story here too, because really my hats are off to our colleague, our Max Taffet, who was from the graduate program, and there were several people, non-Cornellians at EDC, who are working on offshore wind, but Max is one of the leaders of this. And what's been happening is that it's a funny story. About 6 years ago now, we put out a request for proposals for the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, that port facility near the park. And the response included a offshore wind proposal. I'm not sure you know this, Bob. It was a totally different company, but what happened in the interim was the interest in offshore wind grew quite a bit, because the federal agency that oversees the leasing of the waterfront areas had put out an RFP. The winner of that was a company called Statoil, which is sort of like the sovereign, Norwegian energy company that obviously was Statoil, but was now transitioning to clean energy and changed their name to Equinor. So anyway, so the federal government leases these sites. This company no one ever heard of wins the first bid. New York State wakes up and says, holy moly, wait a second, this is real now. And then they were so NYCERDA, New York State Energy Research Development Agency, then puts out its own RFP that says, hey, you know, we will purchase energy from you companies building offshore wind. And they put out an RFP. Two companies share the winning of that RFP. That's Ørsted, which is Swedish, and Equinor, which is Norwegian. And then the NYCERDA kind of divvied up, you know, and said, Ørsted, you go to Long Island, and Equinor, you go to Brooklyn, and upstate New York. Coimans is the other part of Equinor. But what in the interim, the winner of our RFP for South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, which is the operator of the Red Hook Container Terminal, then was found out by Equinor, and they through another RFP NYCERDA did, which put up $200 million in investment funds, and said, look, we'll you know, we know we need port facilities and we need places to plug into the grid, and here's $200 million to help you. And Equinor won that competition and has that funding that they are putting towards the development of SBMT. And so where it stands now is we're now in this process of figuring out now how to do the permitting, the environmental review under SECRA, and NEPA for building the offshore wind platforms in the Atlantic. And so there's 3 levels of environmental review. And then they're figuring out how do you separate out, you know, the port development from the actual building of the wind farm. And Professor Booth, you have a question.
Your comments take me back to those maps you put up.
Yeah.
Of the Hudson Valley, the Mohawk Valley.
Yes.
And it'd be useful to students to think in the future, New York's capturing basis includes the Atlantic Ocean for energy.
Yeah.
And then, as you know, New York State is importing as much hydroelectric as it can from our friends to the north. I mean, the amount of hydroelectric power, which isn't fossil fuel power, but it has its own implications, that comes across the Canadian border is huge and probably is going to get bigger. Yeah. So New York State, depending on electricity coming from way beyond its boundaries.
Yeah, and Professor Booth, I would add the interesting thing with offshore wind is because of the geological formation of the continental shelf, cities like Boston, all of the Connecticut coastline, and then of course Delaware all the way down to the Chesapeake, all are going to be beneficiaries of a whole series of essentially wind power farms that will essentially create that whole new grid that will go up and down the East Coast. So this is, you know, New York statewide, but certainly has, you know, a regional impact that, you know, could really extend along the entire eastern seaboard.
And for New York too, it's the Indian Point nuclear plant and the future of that, and whether we can replace that nuclear energy in time with wind and other sources. The other interesting development too is that with wind comes hydrogen, liquid hydrogen, and that can be also a new fuel source, because I guess you can capture, I guess, the action of the salt water at the wind farms, convert that into hydrogen, and then use that for fuel cells. So it's, you know, everything's connected to everything else. That's the main lesson.
Right, and Andrew, my understanding is that the hydrogen fuel cells are really to be able to use the peak wind capacity, where you can actually store wind in a way that you can, you know, harness that and move it.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Right.
Right. We have just a few minutes left before we have to call it a day or close this colloquium. So I want to just open it up for any last questions. I'm looking around. Okay. Well, it looks like it may be a wrap then, Andrew.
I had one more question.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yeah, I just when you showed the, and Professor Booth kind of touched on this as well, just the sort of larger implications of infrastructure for the entire state and not just New York City. I was wondering if you could speak to the impact of the increase of freight through rail and waterways on upstate New York, and perhaps it driving sort of that classic economy that New York had back in the day when the Erie Canal was developed.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. The Port Authority tried to do a freight barge to Albany to connect Albany to New York Harbor, and that didn't go the first time. But the Port of Albany is part of our consortium with called the North Atlantic Marine Highway Alliance. And if you go, it's really what's old is new again. The Port of Albany has been doing very well with different sorts of commodities, particularly things even like grain from the Midwest. And we see, one of the other things that I've been doing since I left Cornell was I became a Little League baseball coach. So our games are on Riverside Park, and every once in a while you see this big, freighter heading up river, and you're like, what the heck is that? And looking into it, it's it turns out it's grain. And so there is that connection, and I think we'd like to see certainly more more freight moving again on the New York barge system. I think that it is possible. Places like General Electric in Schenectady have used it to move big turbines. And we've also seen the restoration of the Southern Tier Rail road by Norfolk Southern when Norfolk Southern and CSX purchased Conrail in the late 90s. Norfolk Southern reactivated that line, and so I think the economics will increasingly make more sense. I think although in parts of the Thruway, I think you may see autonomous trucks competing with the railroads, but I think whether it's going to be like the Erie Canal, it doesn't really have to be exactly like that again, of course, but but the connections, and the restoration of maritime activity, particularly even from, we've talked about the growing regions of New York State and bringing fresh fruit into the Bronx by water. All of those ideas are on the table if we can level the playing field between trucking and waterborne transportation.
Great. I think Dick's got one last question.
Well, if you want a really big idea that environmentalists like me will fight forever, but it's an idea that's been around for 30 years. Dramatically expand the Erie Canal, dredge it so it's a much bigger waterway, build a large artificial island somewhere off New York, and put up power plant, wind turbines or power plants or whatever. That idea has been around for decades now. Massive dredging across the central part of New York State so that the Erie Canal can handle big ships, not big ships, but much bigger than what they handle now. Yeah, and those ideas have been out there, and they're still around.
Yeah, and Dick, the Europeans are so far ahead of us in terms of autonomous vessels. They call it short sea shipping, and the interstate highway system just took over all of those ideas. But there's a lot of validity. It's not going to work for all freight. It has to be a certain type of freight, but stay tuned. I hope there's going to be more. And I will tell you, the Port of Albany, they're awesome. They come to all of our meetings. So there's some hope. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. Jeff, did you want the last word?
Well, I just wanted to say again, thank you, Bob. Thank you, Andrew, very much. And a really rich both historical review and deep dive into important issues in the city today. So thank you. And everybody, we will see you next week for Gordon Brochu Ingram's talk, and that's environmentalism from an indigenous perspective. So Thank you again and see you next week.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.